Good morning, everyone. So thank you for being on time, and thank you for making the trip here to Albuquerque. So for those of you that I don't know, my name is Patricia Galindo. I'm a staff attorney at the AOC, and thanks to a grant that the AOC has, a VAWA grant, that's what's paying for this conference today. I know a lot of the clerks that are here, that they're DV clerks, we're used to a couple of years of training. We haven't had the opportunity to do that until now. So we're really excited to be able to provide a training opportunity. Overall, what we hear from our court staff, our judiciary staff, is that you all really appreciate any type of training opportunity. And I always tell people that complain about the courts or clerks, I'm like, it's not that people are trying to sabotage or do the job. I think that sometimes we just don't give you all enough training or materials. So our hope today is to really focus on a couple of issues. Of course, dealing with domestic violence, that's one of the subject areas I do for the office, and most of you here have some type of contact. Either your primary role in the office or secondary is to assist petitioners going through the domestic violence order protection process. And that's really an important role, I think, for the judiciary because, as you all know, our statistics show that over 80% of petitioners for orders of protection are pro se. I actually think that's a little bit low. I thought it was higher. But overall, our statistics say that about 80% of them or more are SRLs. And so those pose some unique challenges. You know, actually, before you work for the court, I mean, if you've never been to court, most people don't even know where it's at, what the forms are, and what the process is. So I think that when you add the component of the trauma and the stress that a petitioner is going through in a domestic violence situation, that kind of escalates things. And it makes it even more important for us to make sure that we're helping them. So I'm very fortunate to be partnering for the last couple of years with Paula. You want to stand up, Paula, and say hello?
Hi, everybody.
Can you hear her?
Can you?
There
Yes.
you go.
There you go.
And Paula, do you want to just let everybody know what your title is, since I always get it wrong?
So I'm Paula Costello, Senior Statewide Program Manager for Language Access Services. So we provide interpreters and other accommodations for individuals with who are deaf and hard of hearing or with limited English proficiency that come to the court.
Great.
And I've been very fortunate to find her and to partner up and be able to contribute to this training.
All right. So Paula and I kind of started working on this, you know, well over 2.5 years ago. So to put everything into context, most of you probably know this, but the court started looking at making sure that we are providing adequate services to anybody that's limited English proficient, LEP, that comes to the court. And I guess part of the question is, why is that necessary? So the overview is the Department of Justice does require the courts to provide services. And it's really interesting when we first started looking at this project what that meant. We knew that we needed to improve. We knew that we needed to make some changes. And part of what was identified is, as I mentioned before, because domestic violence, so many of the people are SRLs, and because it's such a vital need for them to get assistance when they come to the court, domestic violence cases were identified as a #1 priority, that we needed to ensure that we were providing adequate services for anybody that was limited English proficient or needed some type of assistance by the court. New Mexico is unique because, you know, we have that court rule that prevents court staff from actually filling out, right, the court forms or participating in that. And what we found out is New Mexico is pretty unique in that. Most states aren't that restrictive. And, you know, I think that going back in time as to when that rule was created, they want to make sure that the court staff wasn't practicing law without a license, giving out legal advice. But our rule really is so restrictive that depending on the court, some courts I've actually heard don't even think that they can have resources, cards with domestic violence shelter information out because they're feeling like they're giving out information. So we really have a wide variety in New Mexico of what's there. So Paul and I, and some different groups that we work with, and several of you here were part of that, looked at how we could increase the services we're providing. And I will give you this anecdote. I think that if somebody comes in and they may speak a little bit of English, giving them a sticky note or a card and telling them to go to an agency somewhere else in town really is not providing a service to that person. And we've heard a lot of different stories of, but we're giving them information to where they can go and get help. That is really the worst case scenario. Other states, there have been lawsuits filed when that's happening, and we really need to make sure that if somebody shows up at the courthouse steps, if somebody comes up to your clerk window or however your court's set up, and they don't speak English, or they are deaf or hard of hearing, there's different things that court staff should be doing, and there's services that the courts do provide you, tools that you can use to make that service to them at the courthouse adequate. And that's really our overall goal of this project. And then couple that with the bilingual form rollout. Can you raise your hand? How many of the courts have already rolled out the bilingual forms? How many of you here? So about maybe a third of you. And so everyone knows what I'm talking about with the bilingual forms. The domestic violence petition, all the DV forms are in an English-Spanish format. So from now through October 1st is when courts are going to be rolling these out. That program, that project was a huge initiative, and I think that there was a lot of concern as to what type of burden that was going to place on the judiciary. We all know, and we very much appreciate all of your hard work. We know that we're working really hard trying to keep up. We know that's hard to fill some of your positions, and some of you are doing the jobs of 2 people. And I think that there was a lot of concern that this would place such a burden on you, it'd be hard to do your job. But I think what we've heard overall rolling out these bilingual forms is it really has not been this tsunami, right, of requests. And it really, I think, and I hope, and we'll talk to some of the courts that have rolled this out, when you are actually providing a service and accommodating these requests, I think that it's making a lot of our court staff feeling really good about themselves because they know that they're not turning somebody away that is coming to the court that day asking for assistance. So that's really what our goal is of this next day and a half, is to collaborate and to review some of the information that we have. Some of you may already know it, and if you're using in your court, what we're looking at is really for you all to stand up and share with one another what it is and how it's not as scary as it seems. I know that change is kind of scary, but I think the courts that rolled it out feel confident, and hopefully by the end of this whole day and tomorrow with some role playing, my goal is when you go back to your courts, you will be better equipped. You'll understand what it is that we have available, what other services we have for you to do, and I think that you will be much more confident, regardless of the language that's spoken, when somebody comes to your court, how you handle that. And I think that, Paula, your staff has done a tremendous job of providing a variety of resources for the courts, and we're going to review those, and we're going to talk about them. And we also want to hear from you as to whether there's any barriers still that we don't know about. It's always good in concept when you create all these systems, but is there something else that's going on that we maybe haven't heard of that's preventing you from doing your job or implementing that? And that's really our goal for the day. So generally, that's what's going on. I think we're really excited about the big turnout. As you can tell, this is the biggest training I've done. So thanks to everyone that's taken time out from their court to come here, and we really hope that you will take the time to really learn, hopefully something new, or at least meet one another. The other goal of this is, especially if you're in a smaller court, I know that it's easy to stay with people that you know. Try to meet other court staff from throughout the state, because what I think is useful is, let's say your supervisor's out for the day, or somebody that always deals with language access, that's your point person, is out sick and something happens. That's the day that somebody's going to come to court, right, and you're going to have to handle that. If we haven't covered it, or you don't remember, or you have a question, I would love for you to have another resource, somebody else that does your job somewhere else in the state, for you to be able to pick up the phone and ask them, hey, I know we learned about this and we never have dealt with it before, but what should I do with this situation? Meeting one another and being able to rely on one another, I think, is also a great tool, and that's the benefit of coming to Albuquerque. We could do this on a teleconference, but the benefit of meeting one another and getting to meet other people, I think, is huge. So even if you're shy, I would encourage you to introduce yourself and try to meet somebody else, a couple other people, and that way you have at least somebody that you could pick up the phone and call, because we all know that'll happen. When that one person that's in charge is gone, that's the day you'll get a very interesting request, and you will still have a resource and know how to deal with that. So again, thank you all for being here on time. Thank you for waking up early and driving. So we have a full day. Did everybody get a packet of information? Yes? Okay. So what we're going to do then is we're going to go ahead and start off with and I think we're right on time, with our morning session. So we are going to be talking about bilingual domestic violence and the domestic relation forms, the ones that I was referencing before, the bilingual forms. We're going to talk about the overview of the policy and the procedure, and we have Paula that will be presenting along with Holly Healy. And Holly is a paralegal in the 8th Judicial District Court, which is up in Taos. And Holly's been instrumental in helping pilot this program. And so her court really has been doing this for quite a while. And the two of them are going to share with you some information on that subject. So welcome again. And if you need anything, the Wi-Fi password. The Wi-Fi password is May 2018, lowercase. So MAY 2018, in case you need the Wi-Fi password. But of course, you won't be on your phone during the presentation. I probably shouldn't have given it to you now. Like, that's what I think about with my kids. I'm like, if you have it, that'll be encouraging you to use it. But anyway, that's the Wi-Fi password. We'll go ahead and do this presentation for an hour. And then after that, we'll have our second one. And we will break for lunch today at 11:45. So I think I've covered the basics. Are there any quick questions before we get started? No? Can everyone see okay? Yep? Everyone can hear okay? All right, great. Well, again, welcome, and I'm going to go ahead and pass it on to Paula and Holly.
Well, thank you so much, Patricia, for having us, and thank you, Holly. And welcome, everybody. Bienvenidos. Language access specialists, can you raise your hand? Okay. So I wanted to give you a big thank you for all the work that you do providing access to our courts and using your bilingual skills on your day-to-day basis. Thank you very much, and thank you very much for being here as well. So let's get started with the presentation. And by the way, you have a heart on your badges. Language access specialists, you have a red heart. That doesn't mean you're going to be donating your organs. We didn't sign you up for that. That's completely up to you for the time being. Oh, we did? We actually, they signed?
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah,
okay.
they should donate their organs. And I just want to say welcome everybody. What Patricia was saying was very, very true about networking. It's really important. I've met some really incredible people at these trainings, and I have relied on them when I'm clueless. And I try not to make it a habit of being clueless, but we all have those moments. So please take the time out, and if you see someone with a badge like yours, because there's 2 other conferences going on, introduce yourself. Tell them a little bit about yourself, and just see what it is that you guys can help each other with. And even if it's just someone listening to you about the troubles you're having in your job, or just getting to know someone new.
The the Judicial Translation Project started back in 2013. It's a committee that has an incredible group of people, like Holly, also judges from the 1st, the 2nd Judicial District Courts, CEOs and translators and members of the community as well. And we've been working on the translation of critical or vital forms, if you will. So the committee started with the translation of domestic violence and domestic relations forms. So we did a lot of research and discussion. We also had 2 pilot projects, one at the 3rd Judicial District Court, one at the 8th Judicial District Court. And we designed an implementation plan which includes accepting pleadings in other languages for domestic violence cases. We received input, endorsement, and finally approval from the New Mexico Supreme Court.
So one of the key elements to successfully implementing any plan is to know what you're doing, obviously, and to put it in writing and make it as clear-cut as possible. And so when you're doing those kinds of things, you want to go with your standard 5 W's. So the first W is who. So who in your organization is going to be accepting the bilingual forms and sending them to the translation team? And who's going to back them up, and who's going to back them up? So you have an idea of who is going to be the responsible person, and if they're out, who's their backup, and then a third backup for as far down the line as you need to go. What is your process going to be? You need to get these documents sent in as quickly as possible so that they can have time to get translated and get back. So do you have someone who can be dedicated to making sure that the cases are open before they get sent in for translation, if that's your court policy? Or are you going to send them out for translation and then open them? These are things that you need to decide among yourselves and make sure that you're clear on what it is that you're going to do. And that falls in with when. When are you going to send the documents? And where will you keep the documents? So that if your child has an emergency and you have to leave, your backup can find the documents once they're translated and returned. One of the things that we've been doing in our court is to make sure that when we send the documents out to the translations team, we CC everybody in our chain. So what happens when the document is translated, they do reply all when they send it back. So everybody in the chain gets a copy. So if you're not there, then for some reason you can't find the documents, at least you have a digital copy that you can file and you can work on giving to your hearing officer or your judge to get reviewed and getting an order issued. And then the last thing you want to think about is why you're implementing your plan the way it is, and what was your thinking behind what you did. And the only reason for this is because you kind of want to maybe get some input from some people and make sure that the plan that you're putting in place makes sense for everybody. And you can always put in your procedure for a trial period and see if it works, and if it doesn't, then say, okay, we're going to try it this way for 6 months, then we're going to all get together and review it and see if we can tweak it somehow. So it doesn't have to be set in stone, but it should be in writing.
Yeah, and I think that's key, to have a plan and to be flexible enough that you can adjust it, because this is something that, we're doing for the first time, and we don't know exactly what type of volume you might get at your court, so you may need to have some adjustments as you go along. So also in your packets you have samples of those forms, but here we have a petition for order of protection and a temporary order of protection. So the format of the forms is what we call intralinear translation. Basically you have the English first, and then we have the Spanish right next to it. And the committee decided this was the best format, because that way all parties get the same thing, and once you have the translation, regardless of whether they speak Spanish or English, they'll be able to understand the form and the content.
And when we docket these in our court, we usually put in a little descriptive text that says, English translation attached, so that if someone's looking at the docket entry, then they know that it was written in Spanish, but that we have gotten the document translated, or another language.
So I wanted to circle back to the why we're doing this. So the provision of vital forms in key languages that are representative of the community is a requirement under Department of Justice to be in compliance with Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So there's certainly a legal requirement for us to be able to do what we're doing and to have those forms available in Spanish. Spanish is the only language in New Mexico, bless you, salud. It's the only language in New Mexico that actually meets the threshold that is set by DOJ. But certainly, there could be other languages later on that we might have to translate forms for. So yeah, it's a legal obligation to provide access to justice at all points of contact. So it's not just having an interpreter during the hearing, but it's also when somebody steps into your courthouse. Where do they go? How do they get help? Or how do they, obtain the service that you're providing? they need to have equal access, right? So what does that mean? That means that you're going to provide a reasonable accommodation with emphasis on reasonable. And certainly translating forms, vital forms of this nature, is a very reasonable accommodation. It's also a public safety issue. So think of somebody that comes to your court and they are in need of an order of protection and they can't obtain one simply because they don't speak the language. And then they might be sent to an advocacy organization where they can help them, but maybe they need to take the bus to get there and they can't do it, or they need to take time off work, or for whatever reason they're not being able to be helped that day. Then there's a public safety issue, of course. And it goes without saying, it's the right thing to do to serve an underserved population.
So the number of LEP individuals has obviously increased because we have more of that population, because we have people that are coming here to get the opportunities that we all have. And so the U.S. Census Bureau estimates that over 24 million people speak English less than very well and would be considered LEP. And they account for over 8% of our population. So if you think about that, in 2015, the U.S. population was 325.7 million people. 8% of that is over 26 million people. That's 26 million people who don't understand our language and are trying to navigate their lives. So if you think of New Mexico having about 181,000 LEP individuals, it's 8% of, it's almost 9% of our population. And this all comes from the Census Bureau, so the numbers are actually probably higher because a lot of those people kind of hide out from the census because they don't understand that it's not there to, make them suffer or to have them deported, so they don't fill out their census. So it could be, anywhere from 2 to 3% higher than that. So I don't think that those numbers translate to what we're seeing in our courts. 8.7% is not the number of bilingual people that I deal with. I would be surprised if it's even half of that amount. So we need to make sure that people know that they have this access to these forms now and can get the services that they need from our courts.
If you want to learn more about fundamentals of language access and all the legal requirements, you can go to that link. It's included in your packet. And it's an interactive training that we developed through a grant from the State Justice Institute a few years ago. And it'll tell you all about ensuring language access outside the courtroom. You can use that for training at your court, share it, and it's great training. So let's talk about the forms. So the forms are going to be located on that link, which we sent to you once we identify a date for your training. So once we have a date for the training, we'll send you that link. You'll be able to download the forms. The forms are available in PDF and in Word format for you to include the header of your court. So you're not allowed to customize them other than to add your court. And just a reminder, the DV and DR forms are not to replace the English-only forms, but they're to be added to your forms, right? So you'll have the English-only and the bilingual format forms. So this is the million-dollar question. How? How do we implement this? How do we do this? And so the domestic relations forms are to be filed in English. So they are offered in bilingual format, but they need to come back to the court filled out in English. DV forms, though, like the petition for order of protection, petition to terminate, etc., all those can be filled out if the person is unable to fill them out in English, to fill them out in Spanish. That being said, all languages must be reasonably accommodated somehow. So say that you get a form filled out in another language, or you get a person who doesn't speak English or Spanish. Don't send them away. Give us a call, send us an email, and we'll figure out a way of accommodating that person. Depending on the language, we'll be able to send you a translation right away if you got that filled out in another language. Or it might be that we need to figure out something else. But we'll find a way to accommodate that person. Just keep that in mind and be in communication with us, because we're here to make this process work with you. Do you want to say anything about your...
Yeah, so people are kind of confused about why we even have the DR or DM forms in bilingual if we're not going to accept them in Spanish. And I think it gives people an opportunity to read what the actual language is, to know what the actual questions are that they need to fill in those blanks and which boxes need to be checked. And so even though we're not accepting them in other languages at this time, I think it gives people a better sense of what it is that is going to happen, and it gives them, if your court gives out the information sheets that go with them, and they're in bilingual format, they can read for themselves what it is that is good, what the process is. And I think that anytime you can give someone information, it makes them feel less powerless. It makes them feel like they have more control over their lives and what's happening to them. So I think it's important that we continue to realize that we have these populations who don't understand our language, and we need to try and use empathy and try and imagine what it would be like if you were in another country and you didn't even know the first thing about what was going on. And think about even the people that we know that come in and file forms in English and they're confused. So it's like, doubly hard for some people who don't speak English to get the services and access justice that they need.
And you have a great point there. And later on, we're going to hear from a testimonial of an American woman who actually lived abroad, and she had a domestic violence situation, and she had to navigate all that system. So, yeah, it's sometimes like putting yourselves in the shoes of that person, right? So the forms that have been translated for domestic violence are basically all of them. So all initiating requests, they will all follow that format that we just saw. The responses also, they've been translated. The templates, right? So how are we going to handle pleadings in other languages, basically when these requests come to the court filled out in Spanish? So first and foremost, it's important to keep in mind that because they're filled out in Spanish, that doesn't mean that they're different. So they should be treated the same way as an English form with the translation component, but they have the same legal weight. And just because we're accepting forms in Spanish and the forms are provided in bilingual format, English and Spanish, that doesn't mean that if in the odd chance that you get something in another language, we're going to say, no, we don't take this. So just give us a call again. It's important to mention that that this doesn't apply to evidentiary materials. Those are the responsibility of the parties to get those translated. However, if there are text messages supporting what in the petition, then we'll translate those, of course. If you want to know more about evidentiary material guidelines, translation guidelines, please go to that link. And it specifically relates to other cases as well, but just I wanted to throw it in there. So we also translated the order templates. And the ex parte orders, the final orders, they all follow that same the same format. So what's the process like?
Can I ask a quick question there? I always wondered this. So when we're talking about the standard orders, that's after the hearing, right? Either your judge or your hearing officer. How many of you here in your courts do your hearing officers or judges use Odyssey, or it's somehow typewritten, like it's formatted already? Does anybody use that? So just a couple. So am I assuming correctly then, does the majority then, raise your hand, do they hand fill them out? No? Okay, so let me see. I'm going to go ahead, and if it's okay to just ask this so we get some more information. I'm going to go ahead, and so everyone can hear, I'm going to hand the microphone when I ask the question so everyone can benefit from the answer. So I heard this side of the table saying, no, we do something differently. So who wants to tell me what you do in your court?
In Portales, after the judge does the order, well, her TCAA is sitting in her office with her headphones on, and she is listening to everything that's going on in the courtroom. So she is typing and filling out the order through Word while they're speaking in the courtroom. She prepares it, takes it in, hands it to the judge, and signatures, and taken from there.
So it sounds as though that the TCA has some kind of a template, right, that has the sample things in the order, and then what she's doing is going into there and typing in what she's hearing happening. Okay, is there any other process that's different than what we talked about? Anybody else? What's happening in Las Cruces? I'm going to go over here now and put you guys on the spot.
We just have like pre-prepared forms, and then the commissioner fills everything in, she handwrites it, and then the judge just signs off on it.
Are any of your judges or hearing officers typing it in themselves so they have like a template, and as they're on the bench, they're filling it out themselves? Okay, I'm going to go this way. I see one hand up.
In Lee County, our judge, he does the DV, and then if he issues the order, he goes ahead and has the template already on his computer, and he signs the order, does the order of what he's going to do, and then we make copies, and I get the copies and hand them to him, and then he signs it over.
Okay. And so no one here, though, is using like an Odyssey document that has the template and they're going in and filling it out. Nobody's doing that? No?
So Patricia, I think I can kind of speak to that a little bit, and that is that as someone who uses the forms a lot, those were only in there recently after the last upgrade, and I don't think anyone made anyone aware that those were going to be there.
Okay, I know that there's a lot of talking, but I wanted to definitely talk about that, and I think that's important, Holly. So I think what typically happens, to put everything in context, magistrate courts really do utilize a lot of what we call Odyssey forms, much more. And one of the things that's interesting to me when I look at it from the AOC's perspective is how can courts utilize technology that we already have, which is Odyssey, to do that? So as an example, and Holly, I think you're right, I think that upgrade happened recently. So I just wanted to kind of get an idea from everybody here, because as we're going forward with these orders, the order seems to be the part that really kind of trips people up, right? Because everyone's like, I really don't understand how that's going to work. We always hear it from our judicial officers. I use custom language. I like to put things in there, which we all understand. But I think most of us would agree that once you know a judge or a hearing officer, they tend to put a lot of the same standard, like boilerplate, template kind of words. So like if a judge wants to say, is very specific about social media and like special language, that judge or hearing officer always uses that language, right? I mean, so what I think is important to know is when we're looking at these orders, first of all, if there's any indication that a party speaks Spanish, we have the order in the English, our traditional one, and the bilingual one. So even if the information the judge fills out is handwritten, specialized for every single case, and is in English, what we're saying is the majority of that information, including, let's say, you are hereby ordered to, you're restrained from doing the following. If that's in Spanish, the person can go, okay, I understand what I'm doing, And even though the context of what the judge wrote, it might be in English, maybe 90% they can understand, because at least it's telling them what they're prohibited from doing, stay away, numbers, the names of their kids. A lot of that they'll be able to understand, right?
So what we did is we developed, so here, for example, you have the template, and on the right, you have standard provisions that the AID used and very kindly shared with the committee. So these are provisions that the judge can just mark which one applies to that specific case, instead of having to reinvent the wheel and having to send something for translation. So these are available to the courts, and if you have special provisions that you normally use in your court, then you can send those for us to translate ahead of time so you are prepared. Granted, there's going to be cases in which those provisions are very case specific. So what we have done, for example, with the first is we received the provision in the body of an email, we translate it right away, and then it can be plugged into the order. But let's go back to the procedure, because I do want to make sure that this is clear. So when you receive a petition that's been filled out in Spanish, the first thing you want to do, I mean, if you maybe you're going to stamp it, or not. I mean, that's up to your court. But you want to send it to us for translation right away, so that we can get it back to your court right away as well. So we'll get your request through that translations-grp@nmcourts.gov. That email is an important email that you should have in your records, because that email will go to a number of people who are translators and will be doing the translations. Don't send those requests to me or to Pip only, because we might be tied up doing something else. So just send them to that email. There's going to be a dedicated translator doing those translations. And it's especially important that you send the request right away if it is a petition, right? Because time is of the essence.
And just so you know, if you work in the courts, if you can't remember the email, if you just start typing TRANS, it'll populate, so that you don't have to memorize that, or if you can't find it and you're like, what am I going to do? Just start typing in that translations, and it'll populate.
So we'll get the scanned copy. You scan the petition. Sometimes what we have seen actually is that they use the bilingual format form, but they fill it out in English, yet the narrative is in Spanish. So if you just want us to translate the narrative, just send us the narrative. We'll translate that and send it back to you. Then you attach that translation to your original, and then you file it. All together, everybody gets the same, the English and the Spanish. Does that work that way?
Yes.
Okay. So again, yeah, we'll return that translation to you right away, and make sure again that all the original and the translation, they're always together. So let's talk a little bit about orders. There's a big difference between ex parte orders and final orders. So for a petition for order of protection, if the judge decides to issue the order, the temporary order, we want to make sure that you use that template if the person doesn't speak the language, right? The petitioner doesn't speak the language. It might be that the respondent doesn't either. So make sure that your court uses the bilingual template for the order and the bilingual standard provisions that can be added and attached to the order, so that both parties have the same access and they have the same information in English and Spanish.
And if your person files in English and they check that they will need an interpreter in Spanish for the respondent, then you want to make sure that you're using the bilingual forms. And the other thing is, for people who open cases, is to make sure that you add that whichever party will need an interpreter. You need to make sure you check that box so that whoever is scheduling that hearing will know that an interpreter is required.
And for final orders, we only have the templates that are going to be translated. Yeah, there's a question over there.
Tone. So if the respondent needs the interpreter, do we have to get the forms translated in Spanish if they're in English?
So you mean the petition?
Yes.
So the petition, if it's filed in English?
But the respondent speaks Spanish.
The order will be a bilingual format.
But if they have to be served with a petition, does it need to be in Spanish for the respondent?
Okay, so what she's asking is, so the petitioner speaks English, filed the English petition.
And the respondent
But-
doesn't understand.
But, yeah, so, yeah, what
So-
would your,
So in that case, certainly the order should be a bilingual template, for sure. We'll do our best to translate also the petition. Now, if it's 5 minutes before 5 o'clock and that needs to go out to serve, the order, right, is what the person will receive, and that is, it is in bilingual format. So the person will understand that they need to stay away from the petitioner. But it really depends on urgency.
and what we've done in the past is we've gone ahead and used the bilingual format for the order, and this was when we were doing the pilot, and then made sure that got out for service, and then we sent in the document for translation and provided the translation to the respondent right before the hearing.
At the hearing, right,
So that
right.
they could read and understand what the allegations were, and gave them time to make sure that they had time to read it and understand it. So I think to some degree, yes, we need to make sure that they understand what the allegations against them are, which they would kind of get in court because it would be interpreted for them, and most judges and hearing officers at least somewhat go over what the allegations are on the record. But if it is one of those things where you just want to get the order done, you can send it in later and say, this is when the hearing is. I would like to have this back before then, so that the translators know it's not as urgent, but it
Right.
is something that you need, and it does have a deadline.
Right, and so give us the deadline, and also remember you'll have a court interpreter at the hearing. Typically the ones that we have received, the petitions we have received, are relatively short. So the court interpreter at the hearing can sight translate what those, what the petition says, the narrative says, if it's a page or so. So you have different options, and again, depends on how time sensitive that is.
Where you're at in Raton, smaller towns might be easier because you know your law enforcement. Typically, it's easier to serve people because they know where they're at, and I think that's a case-by-case basis. But definitely, there has to be some way for the respondent to know what the allegations are, and I think that's what Paula's saying. So, I think that there's different options. I guess one of the things that we like to do is it depends on where you live and what your court process is. So we can definitely talk about that. Is there anybody else that's done this already, that's doing it differently, that would like to share anything? Any of our other courts that are already processing it? So I think that that's not as often, right, Tolly? That doesn't happen as often, but it does happen. Because you think, okay, if one person is English speaking and their partner only speaks Spanish, how do they communicate? But that is could be an issue. So I think as long as we accommodate that and you provide it to them, sometimes before the hearing, you can just make a note in Odyssey and you can have that translation because it's not urgent. If we start getting busier, then that one would get pushed back versus somebody that's sitting in court waiting for their document to be translated before they leave the courthouse.
Hi, everyone. I'm Laura Bassane. I work at the Institute of Public Law, where the Judicial Education Center is housed. I just have a question about the adequacy of notice if someone is only getting that cite translated at the moment of the hearing. It seems like it would need to be a bit more notice to that Spanish-speaking respondent.
That's something that we have considered. Another thing that I know Paula and Holly, you may have been in the meetings that we kind of talked about, and this is kind of throwing these ideas around, is having a label, a sticker made with your court, and it says, it would say it in English and Spanish, if you need the contents of this document translated for you, please contact, and it would have a number. So I think that that could also be a way to do it. Part of the problem with that, Laura, is the delay in getting that to them and getting it served is kind of the hiccup that we're having. But, and I think this happens often when I've seen hearings, judges will reset it for a variety of reasons. So if that individual came in and says, oh my goodness, I didn't even know what she said, I saw the order to stay away, but I had no idea, they're all lies, I need time to prepare, I think that your judges, your hearing officers would definitely reset that hearing. They would leave the court, in theory, that day with it. So I know that that's a potential about the due process and the notice, but there is an opportunity to reset that and give them that information. There's also, the least desirable, I think, is having it translated, site translated by the interpreter for them. And the reason is, although that you're verbally hearing that, I don't know about you, but I forget stuff, and I can't retain that. And it's easier for me to have it in writing, and I think that that's definitely like the best practice is to provide something for them in writing. But that's one of the things that we talked about, and that could be a solution for your court, is having that sticker made up. The big issue then would be who at your court is going to be getting those requests. So let's say it goes out here in Raton. Today we get one, we're in the court, it gets out, and it's tomorrow morning, and your sheriff's officer is serving it, and that respondent is calling your court tomorrow afternoon saying, you know, I got this document and I want to know what it says. Then you could definitely email the translation group email and say, can we get this as soon as possible? Your LAS person on the phone could tell them, okay, we'll get that for you. Can you come to the court on Monday morning? We'll have that available. That could be a process for that little label, and that's one idea I think that we threw around.
Yeah, and it's important to remember, right now people are getting served in English and they don't speak the language, and this is a significant step forward. It is a very reasonable accommodation to do a site translation that is used nationwide, to have an interpreter site translate short documents. Granted, we would all love to have something, you know, an equivalent written translation. From a legal standpoint, from a language access standpoint, a site translation is a reasonable accommodation. And again, it goes back to you know, what the priority is, what we're trying to achieve with this project, which is basically to improve access at first point of contact and make sure that we follow that process along with the limited resources we have, right? So just wanted to keep that in mind. It won't be a perfect process by any means, but it's certainly better than what we have right now, which is nothing. It's in English, right? Final orders, I just wanted to make that point, they're not going to be translated. I mean, the special provisions are not going to be translated unless there's an exception, and it's a very rare case in which we will have to get it done. But the standard procedure is, because it's a final order and there's going to be an interpreter at the hearing and the template is already in bilingual format, the interpreter is the one who might be site translated or interpreting whatever the judge is saying at the hearing.
So we've used site translation a few times at the hearings, and so you guys have probably figured out by now I'm a procedures girl, and want to make sure you guys have some, you know, idea of things that you can do. And so what I've had 2 orders of protection where we've had provisions that were site translated, and I always want to make sure that I cover myself and cover everybody else. So I put some language right near the provision that was site translated that would say site translated by, and put the interpreter's name, and then I have the interpreter and the party that was translated to put their initials there, so that we're clear that they at least got some information. And these are usually really short paragraphs that are specific to that individual and that individual's situation. If it was something more complicated, we would probably take the time to send it out for translation. But if it's just and if it's something that's time sensitive, like in the first case where I had this done, the gentleman had to do something the next day. And so I wanted to make sure he was clear that it had to be done the next day, and that, you know, he probably would not get the order until the end of the day because we didn't have a judge available till then to sign it. So I would always say, if you're going to have site translation done, that you make sure that you make a note of it somewhere, either on the document or in the notes or on the journals in Odyssey.
Great. So again, this is what the temporary order of protection looks like, the template on the left and special provisions on the right, that the judge can check the one that applies. Some options for handling urgent pleadings. So courts have different schedules. Some courts will process orders until 5 o'clock, petitions until 5 o'clock, and stay beyond 5 o'clock until that's taken care of. Some courts won't. So in the case that you have to handle an urgent translation, you can ask a court interpreter or a language access specialist that might be available at the court, or you can always contact your language access coordinator. Peggy is here, and you can contact our language access coordinators and request a site translation of that petition. And then you can include language like what Holly was mentioning. I relied on the interpreting services to understand the contents of this form. Actually, the 1-800 number that you all have, and we'll do training on how to use that service later this afternoon, also provides site translation services in over 300 languages. So that comes handy, including Spanish, of course. So that also comes handy if you need to handle other languages or an urgent document. Finally, do's and don'ts. Make sure that you that you have the forms available to the public. If you see somebody struggling with the language, please make sure that you give them the forms and submit those for translation immediately. Save the original document with the translation. Make sure that they're not separate. And be patient. This process is going to take more time and effort for sure. But it's going to make a huge impact on people's lives. Huge, huge, huge impact. So also, if you have any questions, you can always contact me or contact your language access coordinator. Everybody, you can call Peggy.
Peggy's like, what?
So contact your local language access coordinator, your regional coordinator if you have questions, or you can always contact me. Don't wait until the last minute. And don't send litigants away because they speak a rare language or a non-Spanish language. Please make sure that you contact us and we'll be able to accommodate them somehow.
Yep, even a Portuguese interpreter with 1 day's notice. High five on that.
Do you have anything else?
Well, I mean, the main thing is don't be afraid to ask. If you're not sure, or if it's something really out there, because they work miracles every day, I think. Both our language access coordinators and their staff and the translations group. And so, and if you don't want to send it to the translation people, send it to Paula. She's on her email all day, and if you, but you know, I'm of the opinion that the only dumb question is the one that you don't ask. So always ask if you have any questions or need clarification.
Yeah, and we do have a plan, granted, and we share that when we do the training, when you sign up your court for training, but it's going to be evolving based on the court's needs and the people that we're serving, right? I do want to conclude with some project highlights. This is a multidisciplinary committee that worked very hard to address a complex, multifaceted project. Thank you, Patricia, for everything that you've done. The bilingual forms are available in addition to the English forms. And now we have a standardized, or we will have a standardized policy statewide to handle non-English pleadings, right? The 8th has been doing this for a very, very long time. The 3rd, they also do they have been doing pleadings for a long time, so non-English pleadings. So now, you know, we're getting the other courts on board to make sure that if you are in a if a person is in a domestic violence situation and they have limited English proficiency, that they have the same access in this county as well as this county, right? So we want to make sure that we're fair to everybody statewide. And we also have collaborated with DV advocacy organizations, we'll have them today, and literacy organizations, for example, to set up a volunteer program at the 2nd Judicial District Court, and that's still in a work in progress, but we'll get there.
We're at time.
I think we're ending right on time here. The only other thing I'd like to add to that, Paula, and I did have a conversation with somebody before we started, is regarding the DV organization. So Paula and I have been going to some of the community coordinated response teams, CCRTs, along the I-25 corridor. We haven't made it to all of them. But one thing that you can take back to your court, and one question I had is, how about our DV shelter, or how about our advocates that work in our community? Should they have these bilingual forms? And the answer is absolutely yes. I would encourage you to provide them with the bilingual form. We have them available on Word, and we can email that to everyone, so you can have that. The only thing I would add to that is, as we go to these CCRT meetings, the biggest thing that you need to let them know for these organizations, these service organizations in your community, is don't stop doing what you're doing. We don't want them to think, oh, the courts have all these resources, we don't have to do anything. We're going to submit all of these things in Spanish. We don't want to get swamped with requests. And so what we're trying to tell these organizations is use it as a tool. So if their Spanish-speaking advocate is busy, get out the bilingual form and have somebody in the waiting room start filling that out. But also tell them, and this is a decision that your service providers are going to have to make, there will be a delay for that victim leaving the courthouse with a temporary order, because we have to get it translated. And as long as your organizations know that and they make decisions based on that, then I think that that's good. But yes, go ahead and give them out to your community. Let them know they exist. It can be a resource, but tell them, don't stop what you're doing. This is to kind of fill in the gap. What we had actually envisioned is, this is to fill in the gap for the petitioner that shows up at the courthouse steps with no advocacy, nobody there to explain the process to them so they have access to the courts. So it should never be to replace it, and we hope that that doesn't happen. So as long as you give them that little piece of information, then I think that that gives them an idea on how better to utilize it. And the other thing that I think that I've gotten a question on is the one that the emergency, the EROs that go after hours. How many of you have law enforcement that file the after hours ones with your court? Not very many. Raise your hands again. So just maybe not even a third. So those are available also in a bilingual format. So we've translated those. So if your community uses those emergency orders, the ones that happen after 5 and on the weekends, we have that available, and those can be utilized as well.
However, law enforcement is responsible for making sure that that individual has access, right?
Yes.
So they should have either the 1-800 number, a bilingual officer, or any other type of accommodation to make sure that that person is able to, you know, say, to say what happened.
Right. So that example is, so law enforcement gets called out in the middle of the night or on the weekend.
Don't call Peggy.
Right. So law enforcement has to figure out on their own, because they're the originating agency, how to communicate with that individual. So how are they speaking to him or her in Spanish? You know, so they can use dispatch. Law enforcement has their 1-800 number. They're supposed to use their language access services. So what would happen is the officer would have a Spanish-speaking victim, and how do they find out why they're being called out anyway? They have to have a way to communicate. They would utilize their own tools at their own expense, fill it out, or have the person read it with them, and then that's when they call after hours to your judge, tell them what it says, and then they'll sign it. And they should use the bilingual format, because then,
It's gonna be easier for them.
right, it's gonna be easier for them, because then it tells you what's prohibited. So there is that template already done, that form for the emergency after hours for law enforcement. So I know we're running out of time, but I wanted to answer that, because that has been a
That's a really
question
good
I'm
point.
getting.
Right.
And really, credit to both Holly and Paula. They have done so much work to get this project off the ground, and it's really been evolving, and it's very interesting, and I'm glad that we're talking about some of these little glitches and these customizations. As we go forward, there'll be changes. We will publicize those to you, and if you have any suggestions, also, this is the thing, you're the ones that are handling these on a daily basis. Please email us, because that's what we need. This policy will be evolving, and hopefully it'll be an improvement, but we know that we've taken a huge step forward with the judiciary by having these bilingual forms, and more importantly, by accepting them back in different languages. That's a huge step for us, so we should all be really proud of the work that we're doing to make access to justice to everyone in our state. So thank you very much, and if you have any other questions, please come see us, and we'll try to answer them during the breaks. But in order to stay on task, thank you for this presentation. We'll go ahead and move on to our next series, our next issue. So if you want, I will go ahead and turn on the lights here. Our next session is going to be bilingual domestic violence and domestic relations forms, terminology building, and site translation exercises. That's a big mouthful.
The good thing about this session is that, one, it's interactive. Two, there's candy. So language access specialists, you have on the table copies of the domestic violence glossary. It's an English-Spanish glossary that was developed by Texas. It's great terminology, and those are resources that you are going to use for this activity. English speaking, I'm going to give you here. Peggy, do you think you can just give to those who don't have a heart? I mean, that, okay. So, heartless people. So you will see that they have on their badges. So the ones who don't have a heart get one of these. It's the same. Okay. So if you do have a heart on your badge, you're going to be using the petition for order of protection that is in your packets that's filled out in Spanish. And it's towards the middle of your packet. It's a petition. And you will see that part of it is filled out in Spanish. And so the exercise that we're going to be doing is a site translation. So who knows what a site translation is? Who can explain that? I mean, you all know, language access specialists, what that is, but who can explain that?
Is it on the spot of, translating?
Okay. A site translation? Mm-hmm. Okay. On the spot translating of what?
Any type of document.
A document. So it's the oral rendition, right, of a written document. So basically, you have a document that's written in a certain language, and you're going to read it in a different language, right? So what we're going to do is a site translation exercise. So language access specialists, you have the Spanish version, and all others have the translation or proposed translation of that Spanish petition. So what's the most important thing when you are interpreting or when you're site translating, or if you're monolingual, when you need to know what the other person is saying? What are the things that are important in delivering one message in one language into another language? Accuracy, very good. Is it a word-for-word translation? No. Verbatim? So accuracy has to do with the meaning. The meaning has to be exactly the same. But the words that we use, the grammatical structure that we use in the other language, in the target language, is going to be different from the source language. So let me give you an example. If I say, bye, good luck, how do I say that in Spanish? Okay. Could I say adios suerte? Suerte? Yeah, we can say that. So if I have the Spanish message starting with chao, suerte, that's what we say in Argentina, chao, suerte. Can I say bye, luck? Or do I say good luck? Good. So sometimes I need to add words. Sometimes I need to remove words to be able to convey an accurate message. So that's what we want to do with this exercise. We want to make sure that we're not too concerned about the words, but that we are concerned about the meaning and the intention of what those words mean, right? So language access specialists, please take a look at that narrative of the abuse that's handwritten. And this is an example of this is an actual petition. And you will see that the grammatical structure that's being used is not the usual Spanish, standard Spanish. There are lots of grammatical errors, lots of spelling mistakes. Try to read that narrative, understand what the message is, use the glossary that you have at the table, and then you're going to site translate that to one of your colleagues who is monolingual. English speaking, please take a look at the translation, the proposed translation. And you will see that there are some things that don't make a whole lot of sense, right? If you start reading it. It's not that the translator is bad. The translator is actually is a federally certified interpreter. That interpreter was being very faithful to how the petitioner was trying to relay that message. And that's why you will see that the end result is not a beautifully written and carefully written English text, but it's actually something that reflects the original. So a lot of times the interpreters are blamed, if you will. Well, interpreter, you don't make a whole lot of sense. Well, maybe it's the witness. Maybe it's the defendant. That they are in a situation that they don't feel comfortable with, and they have trauma, and they write however they can. Or they speak however they can, right? Just like me when I don't drink coffee.
Right. I was just thinking, though, and I think that all of us have seen, even in English, sometimes people that don't write well in English, we've seen some very grammatically incorrect. I mean, I heard somebody say sometimes people that are so illiterate that it's almost like hooked on phonics. Like you have to phonetically try to sound it out, right? We're all nodding our head. So if it happens in English, it can happen in a different language. So imagine having one of those very poorly grammatically written statements in English. The translation is going to mirror that. It's not to fix the language. And so I think that's what Paul is trying to say. So if the information that's coming in the different language, the non-English language, is not grammatically correct, then more than likely the translation that we're seeing also is not grammatically correct in English. So does that make sense to everyone? So, I mean, sometimes I know people, are, like Paula said, oh, this is a horrible translation, this isn't done properly, but it's really, and I think that the translation is to carry the same sentiment, the same feeling
Exactly.
across without making it grammatically perfect.
We don't want to clean up language. If there's profanity, we want to maintain that. We don't want to make a person sound better or worse than what they sound or what they have written, right? That's what interpreters do, and that's what we should do when we are site translating a document. So here's a challenge. Peggy is putting some chocolate on your tables because we need to spice things up, right? So monolingual, English-only folks, you're going to control the candy, so you have a power. You will see that in the English-only text, there are some scoring units, some phrases that have been underlined. For each one of those that the language access specialist interprets correctly, you're going to give them candy. They don't know, the language access specialists don't know what those phrases are. But here's the thing. It doesn't have to be exactly the same word. It has to be exactly the same meaning. So they might choose a slightly different word, but if the meaning is preserved, then they get the candy. Don't take their candy. Do you have any questions on what you need to do? Okay, we're going to do some recap. So what are some of the difficulties that language access specialists found with the exercise?
I think one of the things that you always have trouble with, especially when you're sight translating, is the way that you're trained or the way that you speak isn't the way that your customer writes or they speak. And then I noticed that there was a lot of misspellings
Right.
and the way they wrote things out, so it makes it a little bit more difficult to translate it on the spot. You have to actually read the whole document, and then you have to think about it, and then you have to kind of understand where they're coming from and what they're trying to say, because some of the words that you use or you're trained to use are not the same as your customers.
Very good. And that's a key point. You don't want to start sight translating without having at least had a sense of where the story is going. Just like with movies, for example, or novels, when they're translated, the title is translated at the end because you don't really know what it is about, so you can't really translate the title, right? So the same thing with these documents. It's important that you familiarize yourselves with the text. So if you have somebody asking you to sight translate a document, say, well, just give me a couple seconds, well, a couple minutes to familiarize myself with it, get a sense, and then you start, right? Once you kind of got the framework, or the frame, sorry, right? And then you start painting that, the colors, right, of what that story looks like. So very good. Spelling, that's something that we see a lot when it's handwritten. Spelling is all over the place. A lot of times also we get things that are spelled out phonetically because the Spanish speaker is actually illiterate or close to illiterate. So you get something and you can't even recognize that that's Spanish, but you just need some time. And once you start actually saying it out loud, then you say, oh, now it makes sense. But we got a text message actually with a petition that was like that, and it was actually threats being made to this woman. But you couldn't figure that out if you just looked at the document. So it needs a little bit of time. What other difficulties did you find?
Hold on just a second.
Put together, it was a rambling.
Rambling, very good. Lack of punctuation, right? Good. And I think that it really is regardless of the language that you're using. When a person is in a trauma situation, they're scared, punctuation is not going to be very high in their priority list, right?
By looking at the petition, she states in there that he's her boyfriend, but then when she's doing the statement, she's talking about like brother-in-laws and sister-in-laws, and I think that's a cultural thing that we need to realize, because in some cultures, when you move in with somebody, they're not just your boyfriend anymore. They're your husband. So then his family becomes your in-laws. So that's something we need to realize too.
That is a really good point.
And actually, here's the attorney hat coming on. For those of you that deal with DV petitions too, that's another point that we always try to educate on. In the traditional, even in English, you have to be married in order to have an in-law. And that's a question I get from clerks a lot. They get a question like, we're not really sure if this fits the definition of a household member because they're saying it's their mother or father-in-law, but they're not married. So just to clarify that, if you're looking at, this is the lawyer hat again, the household member definition, when it talks about in-laws, there has to be a marriage under the household member definition. But that's also very common in other cultures too, or they use a different terminology for in-laws or for very close friends that, even with our kids, oh, this is your auntie so-and-so, your uncle so-and-so. How many of us have done that with really good friends when our kids are little? And guess what? There's no blood relationship, right?
At all.
Right? So when you think about that in our everyday lives, then you can understand how that translates, that's a funny play on words, translates to people that speak different languages. There's different terminology. And everyone understands too that interpreting, have we talked about that, Paula? Interpreting and translation are two different things.
Right, so interpreting is oral. So when you have a court interpreter in your courtroom, or even when you're doing site translation, that is really oral, so that's interpreting.
So Paula, when you say oral, that means the person is listening to something in a different language and then they're, right?
Yeah, they're speaking in another language. And then written is written translation, right? So that's the big difference between interpreting and translation. What other difficulties did you find?
Well, sometimes they go into there's a lot of slang in Spanish, so they try to use words. One of the words that was in there was paniqueada.
Oh yeah, I thought that was very interesting.
She was just saying she was panicked, but she translated it and she kind of wrote it the same way, paniqueada, so it was not even a
Well,
word.
we call that, how do we call that? Spanglish, right? So I thought that was a very interesting, and a lot of people, they have lived here for a very long time. So even though they might not be fluent in English or their English might be very, very basic, they've heard words like panic. They've heard words like probation, right? So then they start making up their own words and they use those. And sometimes that poses a challenge for the interpreters, right? Because they're trying to figure out what they're saying and they're kind of mixing the English with the Spanish and they come up with some word that it doesn't really exist, but they're using it, and we need to find the translation or an equivalent in the other language. Right. Yeah, exactly.
I noticed a few things. I had a couple wonderful people here working very, very hard. This is very hard work. And I think we just kind of launched in right from the beginning, but I think the point about really giving time for the person to be able to review through the whole document themselves before they're put on the spot to actually speak verbally about what they're seeing in writing is really important. And I think what really struck me is there's kind of two sides to that. I think the judges and hearing officers and other folks that are needing the site translations need to understand that they need to allow that amount of time. And I would highly support and encourage people who are put in this position to screw up their courage and really ask for what you need and say, I need time to be able to review this before I'm going to be able to speak to you about what's in the document.
Great. And that's a really good point. Site translation, actually the mental process for doing this type of work is the same as doing simultaneous interpreting. It's just that the input is a text, whereas in simultaneous interpreting, when you have an interpreter in the courtroom, the input is oral. But the mental process, just think about it. The person is reading, processing that message, and voicing out a message in the other language. And this process ideally should happen simultaneously. So it's very, very complicated. And actually, it's a mode of interpreting that, as interpreters, it's hard. And most interpreters will tell you, I don't really like it. Me, myself, it's not my favorite. So it's very challenging. So yeah, people need time. How about the pace? How about the tone? How about the pauses? Do you think that makes a difference in how you receive that message? So for language access specialists, it's important to take your time, understand what the message is, and then try to keep more or less a constant space. Don't start super fast and then slow down, wait for a minute, process, and then go. Because that kind of throws the listener off, right? And makes the message sometimes less credible, right? So you need to try to be as objective as possible and as faithful to the original as possible. Yes?
But as LAS, we're not really doing site translation because we're just sending it to you guys. So
Right. I mean, some courts will do that. They will do site translation. For example, say that a person comes with a document they got from the court. They come to the court and they say, I got this in the mail. I don't know what it says. Can you tell me what is it? Right? Or you have a certain form or something that you need the person to understand. So you can site translate what that says or kind of give a summary of that flyer that you might have. So that's a site translation. And there's different degrees of formality in how we use that mode of interpreting.
I have a
But that
question, though.
depends on
That's
the
a good
court.
question. And this is me that really doesn't deal with language access like you do, Paula. So as a language access specialist, I know that everyone has to go through training. I know there's a small pay differential. Is a site translation then, Paula, if there's an LAS person sitting here and they're asked to do that, is that part of what their pay differential includes? So are they allowed to do that?
Yes.
Yes.
Now, in the courtroom, you will have a court interpreter, and then we'll listen to Peggy giving us a little demo of this. But outside the courtroom certainly is within the scope of what you can do to assist customers that come to the court and they don't have access to these documents. Certainly, we're going to try to put more efforts in having those documents and forms and standard flyers that you have at the court translated into Spanish and other languages, but site translation again comes handy when a person needs access.
And I have another follow-up question to that. When we're talking about domestic violence petitions, Paula, would there be ever a situation, I think I know the answer to this, would there be a situation where, let's say it's 5 till 5 o'clock, there's this narrative attached to one, that there's an urgency that petitioner has to leave that day with something because they're terrified, they're very scared. Could a DV clerk then call an LAS in the court and say, I really need you to come down to the DV counter, we need you to do a site translation, the judge will be sitting here because the judge really wants to know what this one section says in Spanish, we need to get this processed? Could that be a request that's made?
Yeah, absolutely, and that varies, and it depends on your court, what the court procedures are, but certainly is a very important tool that you can use in last-minute urgent requests.
There's a site translation at 5 o'clock, and let's say it was this exact passage that we had, and the judge or the hearing officer listens to the LAS and goes, okay, I'm going to issue the temporary order and signs it, then how would that be documented, or how do we get that as part of the court file?
So what's going to happen is, at that time, there's standard language that the judge can attach to the order, well, to the petition, right? Sorry, to the petition that's in Spanish. And that will say, I relied on the services of so-and-so to understand the contents of this form. So that will go with the petition. Now, for sure, you want to have a written translation of that document, so send us the request, and we'll get it translated to you as soon as possible. But if it's, and we've heard from some courts who do want to follow that process, not that you have to, but some courts do want to follow that process of accommodating people beyond 5 o'clock and make sure that they get an order of protection if that's granted. So,
To make sure, so is that clear to everyone then, what we're talking about? Are there any questions on how you would utilize, these are for DV clerks, the ones that just have the purple dots, that maybe don't speak Spanish. Does everyone understand how you could utilize site translation with an LAS employee in your court? Does that make sense to everyone? Yep. Okay. If you have any questions on that process and you don't want to mention it in this big group, feel free to come up to either Paula or I or even Peggy and ask us if you have specifics about your court and how that would work.
And I want to close today, today's exercise with asking Peggy, just on the spot, to site translate. She's a certified court interpreter. She's also a language access coordinator. And I just wanted you to get a sense of what the end result or the end product should kind of sound like. Beyond the words, kind of like the tone and the pace, and she'll do a demo for us. If no? Okay. That's easier. So I'm just looking at this. I've never seen it before, but I'll try to do my best. So so-and-so was assaulted with domestic violence by the accused. Due to the names or the names that I'm not aware of, and I also do not know his date of birth. The accused is not the first time, the accused, and then I'm assuming she listed a name, it's not the first time that he has assaulted me while drunk. The night of May 10th, he showed up drunk and very aggressive. He started to attack me verbally and mentally with a lot of offensive words. He left the room and gave the keys to the BMW to his brother-in-law so that the car would not be there in a little while. I heard a lot of noise outside, and I heard when he was breaking the windows of the car and everything else in my car. I looked out the window, and at that moment, I had started to panic. And very scared, so I sent my friend a message so that she would come and get me immediately. At that moment, he came in, and a little bit later, his brother-in-law showed up with a white truck. He did not come back in the BMW. From then, his sister asked me if I wanted for her to take me to a friend's house. And then in quotation marks, I had thought that I was going to go in my car, end of quotation marks. But then I told her that a friend of mine was coming to get me. I thought it was very strange that so-and-so's sister would ask me something like that. Then she asked me if I already knew that the aggressor was going to do that to my car. We're almost running out of time, so Peggy, as an interpreter, what can you add to our discussion? Like, what are the challenges with this, and some tips that you can give us?
So site translation can be very challenging if you don't have a lot of time in your hands. What's really, really helpful is something that I didn't do, which is to read it first and kind of get a sense of what the narrative looks like and where you might get stuck. It also helps you to figure out who's who and what role that person is playing in the story. Who she's referring to, who are the parts of the story, so that when you do get to site translate, you have a better sense of what the story looks like, and it comes out more, I guess, more smooth.
All right. Well, any questions? I hope this was a useful exercise. Please take those glossaries and use them at your courts. And let me know if you have any questions.